The partial ruling means the National Guard cannot be deployed in Chicago or Illinois. The judge will release her written ruling tomorrow. She says the defense did not prove the conditions on the ground rise to the level of needing to deploy the military. She claims it violated the 10th and 14th Amendment. The Attorney General, Kwame Raoul, is praising the ruling, saying it's all about the evidence.
This is about credibility. You heard about the attempt, some of the declarations of acts, alleged acts against ICE officers where they sought out a grand jury indictment that was denied. There's an old saying about indicting a ham sandwich. The defendants in this case couldn't put together a ham sandwich.
The governor of Illinois posting to social media about the ruling, saying in part today, the court confirmed what we all know. There is no credible evidence of a rebellion in the state of Illinois and no place for the National Guard in the streets of American cities like Chicago.
Chicago's mayor also commenting on the ruling, claiming victory. He says in part, the judge established that the Trump administration is unreliable. They lie, misrepresent, and put people in danger. We will continue to use all of the tools at our disposal to end the Trump administration's war on Chicago.
Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle also saying on the ruling, in part, these rulings affirm what we've said all along. Real public safety comes from opportunity, stability, and dignity. We need investments in jobs, housing, education, and health care, not federal forces patrolling our streets.
But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust headlines anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. Okay, so this just happened, and I need you to understand how absolutely insane this is. A federal judge just blocked Donald Trump from deploying the National Guard to Chicago. Like actually blocked him, issued an emergency restraining order. And before you think this is just another legal back and forth, let me tell you what was really going on here. Because this isn't about sending troops to help with some disaster or backing up local cops during a big event. No. This is about something way bigger and way more dangerous than that. Trump was literally trying to take control of state troops, not federal troops, state troops, the Illinois National Guard. And he wanted to use them for immigration raids and, quote, protecting federal personnel, which, come on. You know what that really means? That means troops in the streets. That means federal control over a major American city. That means the kind of thing we used to watch happen in other countries and think, wow, glad that's not us. But here's where it gets wild, and I mean really wild. Trump has been openly threatening to invoke something called the Insurrection Act. You might not know what that is, and most people don't. It's this old law from 1807 that basically gives the president power to deploy military forces inside the United States against American citizens in American cities without asking the governor, without asking anyone. And Trump literally stood at the White House and said, I'd do it if it was necessary. We have an Insurrection Act for a reason. Like he's just casually talking about martial law. Can you believe this? This is the president of the United States saying he'll send in the military if courts don't do what he wants. So Judge April Perry in Illinois heard all this, heard the arguments from state officials who were basically screaming that this was unlawful and dangerous. And she said, nope, emergency order, you're not doing this, not today. Now troops had already arrived, and that's the crazy part. National Guard from Texas and Illinois were already in Chicago, already there for what was supposed to be a 60-day deployment. 60 days. Think about that for a second. 2 months of federal troops occupying Chicago to support immigration raids. This wasn't a quick operation. This was setting up shop. Governor J.B. Pritzker came out swinging, and he said, and this is a direct quote, Trump is not a king, and his administration is not above the law. Which, yeah, that's the whole issue here, isn't it? Because Trump has been acting like the rules don't apply to him, like he can just override state authority whenever he feels like it, like governors are just suggestions. And here's what makes this even more urgent, and you need to pay attention to this. This isn't happening in a vacuum. There are protests happening. Immigration raids are ramping up all over the country. Cities are pushing back against federal enforcement. And Trump's response is send in troops, take control of state military units, threaten the Insurrection Act. This is the kind of moment where you have to step back and ask, what country are we living in? Because this feels like a line being crossed, not just pushed, but crossed. We're talking about the president trying to federalize state forces to enforce his policies in cities that don't want them there. We're talking about military deployment against the will of elected state officials. We're talking about threats to invoke emergency powers if courts get in the way. The judge's order stops it for now, but legal experts are already warning this is headed straight to the Supreme Court. In that showdown, that's going to define presidential powers for a generation. Because if Trump wins this fight, if the courts say, yeah, actually the president can do this, then we're in a completely different America, one where the executive branch has way more power than the founders ever intended, one where states can't protect their own citizens from federal overreach, one where the military becomes a tool for domestic political battles. And all of this is happening with the 2026 elections coming up, so the timing matters, the politics matter, the precedent matters. Because whoever wins this legal battle wins the argument about how much power a president should have. And that's not a small thing, that's everything. So yeah, a judge just blocked Trump's troop deployment to Chicago. But this story is about so much more than one city or one order. This is about whether we still have checks and balances, whether states still have rights, whether the president can just do whatever he wants and dare the courts to stop him. And right now, in this moment, we're finding out the answer in real time. Are you kidding me? This is wild. All right. So let's dig into what's actually happening here, because most of the coverage is missing the bigger picture. They're treating this like it's just another Trump versus the court story. Another day, another lawsuit. But that's not what this is. Not even close. First, let's talk about what Trump was actually trying to do. The official story is that these National Guard troops were being deployed to support federal immigration operations and protect federal personnel. Sounds reasonable enough, right? Support and protect. Who could argue with that? But here's what that actually means on the ground. It means armed military troops conducting immigration raids in neighborhoods. It means federal forces with no accountability to local leaders making arrests in American cities. It means the kind of heavy-handed enforcement that turns communities into war zones. And it means doing all of this without the consent or cooperation of the state government. Illinois didn't ask for these troops. Governor Pritzker didn't request help. Chicago's mayor didn't say, hey, we need military backup for immigration enforcement. Trump just decided. He decided Illinois needed federal troops, and he was going to send them, whether the state wanted them or not. And then he was going to put them under federal command, take them away from state control, make them answer to him. That's the part people aren't getting here. The National Guard normally answers to the governor, and that's how it works. Each state has its own guard, and the governor is the commander. The president can federalize them in emergencies. But there are rules, procedures, legal requirements. You can't just snap your fingers and take over another state's military forces because you feel like it. But Trump was trying to do exactly that. And when people started pushing back, when lawyers started filing motions, when governors started objecting, he doubled down. He went on television and threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act, which is basically saying, I don't care what the courts say, I don't care what the governors say, I have this law and I'll use it. Now the Insurrection Act is real. It's been on the books since 1807. And yeah, technically it gives the president power to deploy military forces to suppress insurrection or enforce federal law when normal means aren't sufficient. But come on, that law was written for actual insurrections, rebellions, the kind of chaos where normal law enforcement completely breaks down. Not for immigration enforcement, not for backing up ICE raids, not because the president doesn't like how a city is run. And here's the thing about Trump threatening this, he's done it before. During his first term, he talked about invoking it during the Black Lives Matter protests. His team drew up plans, they had meetings about it, and now he's president again, and he's bringing up the same threat, except this time, he seems more serious. This time, he's actually moving troops around. This time, the language is more direct. I'd do it if it was necessary. That's not a hypothetical. That's a promise. So Judge Perry looked at all this and basically said this is not how any of this is supposed to work. You can't just override state authority because you want to. You can't threaten martial law tactics because courts might rule against you. You can't deploy troops to a state against the governor's wishes for routine law enforcement operations. And she issued an emergency restraining order to stop it. Emergency, that word matters. It means she thought the situation was urgent enough that waiting for normal legal procedures would cause irreparable harm. It means she saw Trump's actions as such a serious threat that she had to intervene immediately. Federal judges don't do that lightly. They don't issue emergency orders unless something really dangerous is happening. And what's happening is this. Trump is testing the limits. He's pushing boundaries. He's seeing how far he can go before someone actually stops him. And every time he does this, every time he threatens emergency powers or tries to bypass normal procedures or ignores traditional limits on executive authority, he's setting a precedent. He's normalizing behavior that used to be unthinkable. Think about what we're accepting as normal now. The president threatening to invoke military emergency powers if courts block his orders. That used to be banana republic stuff. That used to be the kind of thing dictators did. But now it's just Tuesday. Just another Trump headline. Just another norm being shattered. And the really scary part? Half the country doesn't care. Half the country hears this and thinks good. Use whatever power you have. Do what needs to be done. Who cares about legal niceties when there's an immigration crisis? But that's exactly how democracies die. Not with a bang, with a shrug, with people saying, well, this situation is special, this emergency is real, we need a strong leader who's willing to break the rules. Except the rules exist for a reason. Checks and balances exist for a reason. The separation of federal and state power exists for a reason. Because when you give one person, any person, too much power, they abuse it every time, throughout history, no exceptions. And what Trump is doing here connects to a much bigger pattern. He's been pushing for expanded executive power since day one of his second term. He's tried to federalize local law enforcement in multiple cities. He's threatened to withhold funding from states that don't cooperate with immigration enforcement. He's talked about deploying federal forces to Portland, to Los Angeles, to New York. This isn't just about Chicago. Chicago is the test case. If he wins in Chicago, if the courts eventually say, yeah, the president can do this, then he'll do it everywhere. Every Democratic-led city that pushes back on his policies becomes a target. Every governor who doesn't fall in line faces federal troops. Every state that tries to protect its residents from aggressive federal enforcement gets overruled. And let's be clear about what's driving all this immigration. That's the issue Trump is using to justify this expansion of power. He's framing it as a crisis that requires extraordinary measures. He's saying the states won't enforce the law, so he has to. He's positioning himself as the only one willing to do what's necessary. But here's what they're not telling you. Immigration enforcement doesn't require military troops. ICE exists. Border Patrol exists. There are thousands of federal law enforcement officers whose literal job is immigration enforcement. The reason Trump wants the National Guard involved is optics. It's the show. It's the imagery of troops in the streets rounding people up. It's about looking tough and decisive and in control. And it's working. His base loves it. They see the troops deploying and they think, finally, someone's taking this seriously. Someone's not playing games. But what they're not seeing is the cost. The constitutional cost. The precedent cost. The cost of turning the military into a domestic political tool. This is what the judge stopped. Not just a troop deployment. Not just an immigration operation. She stopped the normalization of military force as a presidential option for any policy he wants to push. She stopped Trump from erasing the line between federal and state authority. She stopped what could have been the beginning of something much darker. But it's only temporary. The order is temporary. And Trump's team is already appealing, already preparing the next move, already talking about how they'll take this to the Supreme Court if they have to. And then we find out if the highest court in the land thinks the president can do this. And depending on that answer, we might be living in a very different country very soon. This is wild. Like, this is actually wild. Okay, so let's break this down into simple points because I want you to understand exactly what's at stake here. Point 1, Trump tried to deploy National Guard troops to Chicago without the state's permission for immigration raids. Judge blocked it with an emergency order. That's the headline. But the reality is way more complicated. What he was really doing was testing whether he could override state authority and take control of state military forces for federal operations and not emergency operations, not disaster relief, not an actual crisis, immigration enforcement, routine policy stuff, which if he can do that, if a president can just federalize state troops whenever he wants for whatever policy priority he has, then state sovereignty basically doesn't exist anymore. Point 2, Trump openly threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act if courts got in his way. Let that sink in. He stood at the White House and said, if the courts block me, I have this emergency law and I'll use it. That's not how it's supposed to work. Courts are supposed to be a check on presidential power. They're supposed to be able to say no, but Trump is essentially saying your ruling doesn't matter because I have bigger powers I can invoke. This is textbook authoritarianism. You know what other leaders do this? You know who else threatens emergency powers when courts rule against them? Not the good guys, not the democracies, the dictators, the strongmen, the people who think they're above the law. And yeah, I know that's a strong word, but when someone literally threatens to invoke military emergency powers because they don't like judicial oversight, what else do you call it? Point 3. This isn't just about Chicago or Illinois. Trump has been doing this all over. He's threatened Portland. He sent federal forces to California. He's talked about New York. Every Democratic-led city that pushes back against his immigration policies becomes a target for federal intervention. And every time he does this, he's setting up the same conflict. Federal power versus state rights, presidential authority versus local control. And he's betting that eventually the courts will side with him. And here's why that bet might pay off. The Supreme Court is conservative, 6-3. Trump appointed 3 of those justices. So when this case inevitably reaches them, and it will, there's a real chance they side with expanded presidential power. They might say, yeah, immigration is a federal issue. The president needs tools to enforce it. States can't block him. And if they do, if the Supreme Court gives Trump this power, it changes everything. Because it's not just about immigration. Once you establish that the president can override states and deploy military forces for policy enforcement, that power exists forever. The next president has it, and the one after that, Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter. The precedent is set, and presidents always expand on precedents. They never give power back. Point 4, the timing matters. We're heading into 2026 elections. Trump is ramping up immigration enforcement and military rhetoric right as campaigns are starting. That's not coincidence. This plays to his base. The imagery of troops deploying, of federal forces taking action, of a president who's tough and uncompromising, that's the brand, that's the message. And legal battles with liberal judges and Democratic governors, that's just more fuel for the narrative that they're trying to stop him from keeping America safe. But here's what gets lost in all that political theater. Real constitutional principles, real limits on power, real protections that have kept America from sliding into authoritarianism for 200 plus years. Those things don't poll well. They're not exciting. They don't make for good rally speeches. But they're what actually matter. They're what actually keep us free. So what happens next? Trump's team appeals. They're probably already drafting arguments about presidential authority and immigration crises and states failing to cooperate. They'll forum shop. They'll try to get this in front of friendly judges, and they'll move fast because the political calendar is ticking, and Trump wants this fight now while he has momentum. Illinois and other states will fight back. They'll argue this is unconstitutional federal overreach. They'll point to precedent about state control of National Guard. They'll warn about the dangers of militarizing immigration policy, and they'll try to keep this in lower courts as long as possible because they know the Supreme Court is risky. Meanwhile, protests are going to intensify because people are watching this. People are seeing federal troops deploying to cities. People are seeing the president threaten emergency powers, and people are going to take to the streets, which actually might be what Trump wants because protests give him an excuse, give him a reason to say, see, we need order, we need control, we need those emergency powers, and around it goes, action and reaction, deployment and protest, court order and appeal, each side escalating, each side convinced they're fighting for America, and in the middle of it all, the actual Constitution, the actual laws, the actual principles that are supposed to govern all this getting bent and twisted and tested in ways they've never been tested before. Here's the bottom line. A judge blocked Trump's troop deployment for now, but this fight is just beginning. This is going to the Supreme Court. This is going to define presidential power for a generation. This is going to determine whether states can still protect themselves from federal overreach or whether the president can just override them whenever he wants. And depending on how that goes, we might be looking at a very different America. One where the military is a routine tool of domestic policy. One where states can't say no to federal force. One where presidential power is limited only by what the president thinks is necessary, which is basically unlimited. So yeah, keep your eyes on this. This matters. This really matters. Because the precedent set here, we're going to be living with for decades. And if we get it wrong, if we normalize this kind of presidential power, there's no going back. Once you give that power away, you never get it back. And that's what's really at stake. Not just troops in Chicago, not just one deployment or one court case, but the fundamental balance of power in American democracy. Whether we still have one or whether we're transitioning into something else. Something where one person has too much power and not enough people willing to stop them. Wild times. Truly wild times. And this story is far from over. Stay tuned because whatever happens next is going to be big.